I did my presentation on Chapter 3 of Privilege, Power, and Difference by Alan Johnson. The chapter was titled Capitalism, Class, and the Matrix of Domination. So an overview of capitalism. Capitalists want to make the most money possible. They do this in two phases. The first one is the investment phase, where capitalists use the money they already have to pay for the labor and materials needed to produce a product. Then they move on to the gain phase, where capitalists sell their product at a higher price than it took to make it, and therefore make a net gain. And the whole goal for a capitalist is to spend the least money possible during the investment phase by paying workers the lowest wages possible, so that they make the most net gain in the gain phase. And capitalists own the factories and the equipment needed to make products, and therefore the capitalists control the wages that workers are paid. So how capitalism affects class. Capitalism leads to inequality in terms of class and status. In the U.S., the people at the top of the class system have the majority of the money and business. However, these people make up a very small amount of the population in the U.S. As you go further down the class ranks in the U.S., you will notice that the poorer sections of the population have the most people in them, but that they have the least amount of total money compared to higher class groups. This inequality results in some people having much more than they need, and many people having much less than they need as a result. In other words, the wealth is not distributed evenly. So all this is saying is that they explained it in the book as about the wealthier 10% of the U.S. population has control of most of the money and business and resources, whereas the lower, poorer 60% of the U.S. population does not have much money split among them or resources. How capitalism led to discrimination. It all began when U.S. plantation owners started using African American slaves for cost-effective labor. The idea of a white group that was superior to other racial and ethnic groups was made up by capitalists in order to justify their unethical actions. Capitalists used this idea in order to get away with paying white workers lower wages. So, basically what capitalists did is made their white workers feel better or superior to other minority workers, and therefore they could get away with paying them lower wages, and the white workers wouldn't retaliate, or that was the idea. And what would happen if a white worker retaliated was that the capitalist or owner of the business would fire them, or threaten to fire them, and say that they would replace them with a minority worker that they could pay a lower wage. And this idea also pitted white workers and minority workers against each other. So instead of working together to fight for better wages, white workers and minority workers were kind of competing for jobs because of this white group system that was made. Privileges and lack of privileges. So at the end of the chapter, he talks about four main groups that are privileged or either have a lack of privilege, and these are based on sex, race, ability, and sexual orientation. Therefore, people can be privileged in some ways and have a lack of privilege in others. And even though someone is privileged, they may not feel like they are due to a lack of other privileges. So, if you have a white male who is also gay and not able-bodied, then he is part of two of the privileged groups. He's part of the privilege of sex and race, but he does not have privilege in the groups of ability and sexual orientation, so he has some privileges but not others, and these privileges and disprivileges or non-privileges kind of cancel each other out in this case, and can make him feel like he doesn't have any privilege at all. Or if you have a white man who is able-bodied and heterosexual, then he can also feel non-privileged, even though in fact he is privileged, because he is comparing himself to other people in his privilege categories, and he might not stack up to them, so he doesn't feel like he has privilege, even though he does. And privilege and lack of privilege are typically not clear-cut. All types of discrimination and privilege relate to each other in one way or another. So all this is saying is that in terms of capitalism and who a boss is going to hire, it honestly depends on if the boss has any discriminations against certain groups of people, and that's something that's going to vary from boss to boss, so you really don't know what they may or may not discriminate against. And that's it.